There's an enemy millions of people believe is hunting them constantly, an invisible, malevolent force tempting them toward sin, planting evil thoughts, orchestrating their downfall, waiting to claim their souls. The devil, Satan, Lucifer, the adversary. You've been taught he's real, he's powerful, and he's personally invested in your damnation. Churches warn about his schemes. Exorcists claim to cast him out. Believers attribute every dark impulse to his influence. But here's the unsettling question. What if the devil isn't an external entity at all? What if he's psychological projection of everything you've been taught to deny about yourself? Watch what happens when someone experiences thoughts or desires their religion condemns. They don't think, I'm having a natural human impulse that conflicts with my moral framework. They think, Satan is tempting me. The thought gets externalized, attributed to foreign influence, rather than acknowledged as arising from within. This externalization serves crucial psychological function. It preserves sense of self as purely good by projecting darkness outward. You're not the source of forbidden desires. The devil planted them. You're not capable of cruelty. Satan influenced you. You're not wrestling with your own shadow. You're under demonic attack. This creates strange psychological split where people become alienated from parts of themselves. The anger you feel but aren't supposed to feel. That's demonic influence. The sexual thoughts you have but religion condemns. Satan's temptation. The doubts about faith that emerge naturally. The devil trying to destroy your belief. Everything deemed unacceptable gets labeled as not self, as foreign invasion, as spiritual warfare. But those thoughts, feelings, and impulses don't come from outside. They arise from your own psyche. Calling them demonic doesn't make them external. It just prevents you from integrating them, understanding them, or developing mature relationship with your own internal complexity. One philosopher recognized this pattern as one of Christianity's most sophisticated psychological operations. He understood that creating external devil serves institutional control by preventing people from confronting their actual internal struggles. If your darkness is caused by Satan, you need church to fight Satan for you. You need priests, prayers, rituals, constant vigilance against external enemy. But if your darkness is just unintegrated aspects of yourself, you need self-knowledge, honest examination, psychological maturity, things that don't require institutional mediation. The devil keeps you dependent. Self-knowledge makes you autonomous. Guess which one religious institutions emphasize? The question isn't whether evil exists or whether humans are capable of terrible things. The question is whether attributing that capacity to external supernatural entity helps you deal with it or prevents you from dealing with it. Because here's what psychology has discovered. The parts of yourself you deny don't disappear. They operate unconsciously with more power because you're not aware of them. They emerge as compulsions you can't explain, as sudden rages that seem to come from nowhere, as self-sabotage you don't understand. The shadow you refuse to acknowledge doesn't go away. It just goes underground, and calling it Satan rather than recognizing it as your own denied aspects doesn't weaken it. It strengthens it by keeping it unconscious. Can you handle examining whether the devil you've been fighting is actually the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject? Here's what doesn't make sense about the devil as external entity. The concept evolved dramatically over time, becoming more elaborate and personified exactly when Christianity needed external enemy to explain internal struggles. Early Judaism had no Satan figure as we understand it. The Hebrew word Satan means adversary or accuser, appearing in Job as member of God's court testing humans, not as evil opposing God. It's a role, not a rebellious angel. The serpent in Genesis isn't identified as Satan in the text. That connection was made centuries later through reinterpretation. Early Jewish theology didn't need personified evil entity because it accepted that humans are capable of both good and evil without external corruption. Then something shifted as Christianity developed. Satan transformed from heavenly prosecutor into cosmic rebel, fallen angel leading demonic armies against God. The New Testament introduces more developed Satan figure, tempter in wilderness, prince of this world, dragon in Revelation. But even here, development is progressive. Earlier writings have less developed Satan theology than later ones. By medieval Christianity, devil mythology became elaborate. Hell's hierarchy with named demons, specific temptation strategies, detailed accounts of Satan's fall, extensive demonology. This wasn't biblical revelation remaining constant. It was mythology expanding to serve psychological and social functions. The timing reveals the pattern. Satan theology intensified during periods when Christianity needed to explain why believers still struggled with forbidden impulses despite accepting salvation. If Jesus freed you from sin, why do you still sin? Early answer: you're still human and humans struggle. Later answer: Satan is attacking you. The second answer preserves theology that Christians should be pure while explaining obvious reality that they're not. It externalizes the problem. You're saved and would be pure except external enemy is attacking you. This protects both believers' self-image and church's theological claims. Neither believer nor theology is inadequate. Satan is just powerful. Consider also what gets attributed to Satan versus what doesn't. Sexual temptation is demonic. Greed that benefits church through donations isn't. Doubt about doctrine is Satan's influence. Unquestioning obedience to church authority isn't. Pride in personal achievement is demonic. Pride in religious identity isn't. The pattern shows Satan gets blamed for impulses that threaten church control, autonomy, skepticism, sexual independence, intellectual questioning. Meanwhile, impulses that serve institutional interests, obedience, donations, missionary zeal, aren't coded as potentially problematic even when they cause harm. Satan is convenient explanation for why people resist church teaching while thinking they're resisting evil. The psychology is revealing. When you externalize internal struggles, you avoid responsibility for examining them. If Satan made you angry, you don't need to explore why you're angry or whether the anger is justified. If Satan planted doubts, you don't need to investigate whether the doubts are valid. If Satan tempted you sexually, you don't need to develop mature sexual ethics beyond resist temptation. The devil becomes catch-all explanation preventing psychological growth. You're not wrestling with complex internal landscape of competing desires, values, and impulses. You're just under attack by external enemy. Much simpler, much less psychologically demanding, much more dependent on religious authorities who claim expertise in spiritual warfare. Nietzsche identified this as projection mechanism fundamental to Christian psychology. Everything you're taught is sinful but still feel naturally. Desire, anger, pride, doubt gets projected onto external demonic figure. This preserves self-image as fundamentally good Christian while explaining continued presence of unacceptable aspects. But psychologically, it's disaster. You become alienated from your own depths, unable to integrate your shadow, constantly at war with parts of yourself you're calling Satan, the exhaustion of fighting yourself. While thinking you're fighting external enemy is itself form of psychological self-harm. And churches encourage it, because psychologically exhausted people who think they're under constant demonic attack are more dependent on institutional protection. What does it mean that the devil you're taught to fear looks suspiciously like the parts of yourself you're taught to reject? Friedrich Nietzsche grew up saturated in devil mythology, and the psychological damage was intimate and profound. His Lutheran upbringing in mid-19th century Germany included constant warnings about Satan's schemes. He was taught that the devil was real, active, personally interested in destroying his faith and claiming his soul. Every forbidden thought was potential demonic influence. Every doubt was Satan's whisper. Every natural impulse that conflicted with Christian morality was spiritual warfare requiring constant vigilance. The result was psychological state of permanent siege, feeling under attack by invisible enemy, attributing his own thoughts and feelings to external malevolent force. This created exhausting internal division. When Nietzsche felt pride in his intellectual achievements, he had to fight it as demonic temptation. When he experienced doubt about Christian doctrine, he interpreted it as Satan trying to destroy his faith, rather than as natural intellectual questioning. When sexual thoughts emerged, normal for adolescent boy, he treated them as demonic attack requiring spiritual warfare. He was taught to be constantly suspicious of his own mind, to monitor every thought for satanic influence, to never trust his natural impulses because they might be corrupted by evil external force. This is profoundly alienating way to relate to yourself. You're never just having thoughts or feelings. You're always potentially hosting enemy. The turning point came through Nietzsche's study of psychology and his own honest self-examination. He started noticing that the thoughts he'd been attributing to Satan were just his own thoughts. The doubts about Christianity weren't external attacks. They were his own mind recognizing contradictions and demanding coherence. The desires weren't demonic temptations. They were natural human impulses that happened to conflict with arbitrary religious prohibitions. The anger wasn't Satan's influence. It was his own response to being taught to hate parts of himself. Everything he'd externalized as demonic was just his own psyche trying to operate naturally, while religious framework coded natural operations as supernatural warfare. This recognition was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant he wasn't under constant attack, that his mind was his own, that he could trust his thoughts and feelings as arising from himself rather than from external enemy. Terrifying because it meant taking responsibility for his own darkness, acknowledging capacity for thoughts and impulses Christianity condemned, facing that he contained contradictions and shadows without external villain to blame. The devil had been convenient scapegoat. Removing him meant confronting his own complexity directly. Nietzsche began investigating in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in works like Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morals. He was mapping how Christianity uses devil mythology to prevent psychological integration, how projection of shadow onto external entity keeps believers fragmented and dependent, how fighting demons outside prevents confronting demons inside. This wasn't abstract philosophical analysis. It was understanding psychological machinery that had operated in his own mind, that had kept him alienated from himself, that had prevented him from becoming whole by teaching him to reject parts of himself as satanic. What made his analysis particularly powerful was recognizing that most people can't distinguish between thoughts arising from their own psyche and thoughts they believe are externally implanted. The psychology doesn't feel different. A thought is a thought. But if you've been taught that some thoughts are yours and some are Satan's, you develop paranoid relationship with your own mind. You're constantly evaluating whether thoughts are trustworthy or demonic, whether feelings are acceptable or require spiritual warfare. This creates psychological exhaustion and prevents development of mature self-relationship, where you acknowledge all aspects of yourself, integrate your shadow, and develop ethics based on understanding yourself rather than fighting yourself. The personal cost was enormous. Years of psychological fragmentation, of treating his own thoughts as potential enemy attacks, of exhausting vigilance against himself while thinking he was vigilant against Satan. Recognizing the devil was projection didn't immediately heal that damage. The patterns were deeply trained, but it began process of psychological integration, reclaiming the parts he'd been taught to call satanic, understanding them as his own, developing relationship with his whole self rather than just approved aspects. This is what his philosophy of self-overcoming was about, not transcending your humanity, but integrating all of it, including the parts you've been taught to deny. Nietzsche's first concrete evidence came from examining what people attribute to demonic influence versus what they claim as their own thoughts. The pattern is remarkably consistent across Christian believers. Thoughts that align with religious teaching are attributed to self, Holy Spirit, or God's guidance. Thoughts that conflict with religious teaching are attributed to Satan's temptation. But this attribution isn't based on the thought's origin. They all arise from the same mind. It's based on whether they fit accepted framework. The demonic thoughts aren't qualitatively different from godly thoughts. They're just thoughts the framework rejects. This becomes obvious when you examine sexual thoughts, which Christianity heavily codes as potentially demonic. A married Christian man experiencing attraction to his wife attributes it to natural God-given desire. The same man experiencing attraction to a woman who isn't his wife attributes it to demonic temptation. But both thoughts arise identically from his own psyche, processing visual stimuli and feeling attraction. The difference isn't origin. Satan didn't insert one thought while God approved the other. The difference is how religious framework categorizes them. One is acceptable, so it's your thought. One isn't acceptable, so it's demonic attack. The externalization is arbitrary psychological defense mechanism, not accurate description of different thought sources. Nietzsche found same pattern with doubt. When believer has confidence in faith, they attribute it to Holy Spirit strengthening belief. When same believer has doubts, they attribute it to Satan attacking faith. But confidence and doubt are both natural psychological states arising from that person's mental processes. Sometimes evidence and experience support beliefs, producing confidence. Sometimes contradictions and questions emerge, producing doubt. Neither state is externally implanted. Both arise from same mind processing information and experience. Coding 1. As demonic prevents honest examination of whether the doubts have merit, whether they're pointing to real problems that deserve investigation rather than spiritual warfare. The evidence became clearer when Nietzsche examined what happens when people resist temptation. They attribute victory to God's strength and defeat to Satan's power. But both outcomes are their own choices. When you resist impulse to act on inappropriate attraction, you're exercising self-control based on your values. When you fail to resist, you're prioritizing immediate gratification over longer-term values. Neither involves supernatural forces. Both involve your own psychology, your competing motivations, your capacity for delayed gratification, your values hierarchy. Externalizing both success and failure prevents understanding your own psychology. You never learn what actually helps you make choices aligned with your values because you attribute everything to spiritual forces rather than examining your own decision-making processes. What emerged from this evidence was recognition that devil serves as projection screen for disowned aspects of self. Everything you're taught is unacceptable about being human. Anger, lust, pride, doubt, selfishness, aggression gets labeled satanic and externalized. This prevents integration. You can't develop mature relationship with your anger if you think anger is demonic. You can't develop healthy sexuality if you think sexual desire is Satan's tool. You can't grow intellectually if you think doubt is spiritual attack. The devil becomes repository for your shadow, all the parts of yourself that exist but aren't allowed to exist in your self-concept. And as long as the shadow is externalized as Satan, you can't integrate it, can't understand it, can't develop conscious relationship with it. You remain psychologically fragmented, at war with yourself while thinking you're at war with external enemy. How convenient for institutions that benefit from you staying fragmented and dependent rather than becoming integrated and autonomous. Nietzsche pushed deeper and found that devil mythology doesn't just externalize individual shadow, it externalizes collective shadow. Everything a culture finds unacceptable gets projected onto Satan. This is why devil imagery evolves to match cultural anxieties. In medieval Europe, when plague and famine created existential terror, Satan became physical torturer, inflicting bodily suffering. During witch hunts, when female sexuality and power threatened patriarchal order, Satan became seducer of women, granting them dangerous independence through demonic pacts. In Puritan America, when wilderness represented chaos threatening ordered civilization, Satan was lord of the forest, tempting colonists away from godly communities. The pattern continues in modern devil mythology. When evangelicals feel threatened by sexual revolution, Satan becomes tempter toward sexual liberation. When they feel threatened by scientific materialism, Satan becomes deceiver spreading atheistic evolution. When they feel threatened by social justice movements, Satan becomes force behind cultural Marxism. The devil adapts to represent whatever the community most fears and rejects. This isn't because Satan is real and taking different forms. It's because Satan is projection screen for collective anxiety. The culture's shadow, everything it denies about itself, gets externalized as demonic threat. This serves crucial social control function. If cultural shadow is recognized as culture's own darkness, its violence, its exploitation, its hypocrisy, that requires confronting systemic problems and making changes. But if cultural shadow is externalized as Satan attacking from outside, the culture seems innocent and under siege. No need for self-examination, no need for reform, just need to fight external enemy. When America's history of slavery and genocide threatens national self-image, externalizing those as Satan's influence on some individuals rather than acknowledging them as systemic cultural sins allows the culture to avoid reckoning. The evil was Satan working through bad people, not our collective shadow we need to integrate. Nietzsche documented how churches deploy devil mythology to prevent examination of their own shadow. When church covers up sexual abuse, Satan is blamed for infiltrating church, rather than acknowledging that celibacy requirements and power structures create conditions enabling abuse. When church accumulates wealth while preaching about poverty, Satan is blamed for prosperity gospel heresy rather than examining how institutional Christianity serves capitalism. When church supports war and nationalism, Satan is blamed for Christian nationalism rather than confronting how religion has always served empire. Externalizing the shadow as demonic prevents institutional accountability. The church remains pure and holy, just under satanic attack, rather than acknowledging it contains same capacity for darkness it condemns in secular world. The psychological mechanism making this work is splitting, primitive defense mechanism, where everything is divided into pure good and pure evil with no integration. you're entirely good. Satan is entirely evil. Your group is righteous. Enemy groups are satanic. Your impulses that align with approved values are your true self. Your impulses that conflict are demonic invasion. This prevents psychological maturity, which requires recognizing that everything contains both light and shadow, that you're capable of both good and evil, that same impulse can serve different purposes in different contexts. Splitting keeps you psychologically childish, dependent on external authority to tell you which impulses are you and which are Satan. Mature integration would make you autonomous, capable of self-examination without externalizing your darkness. But autonomous, integrated people don't need religious institutions to fight Satan for them. They handle their own psychology. That's precisely why devil mythology persists. It creates permanent dependence on institutions claiming expertise in spiritual warfare. What does it mean that your greatest enemy is constructed to ensure you can never face him without intermediaries who benefit from your continued need for their services? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered becomes undeniable when you examine who gets labeled as influenced by Satan versus who doesn't. It's never the powerful defending status quo. It's always those challenging authority or threatening established order. Heretics who questioned church doctrine were doing Satan's work. Reformers who challenged church corruption were satanically inspired. Scientists whose discoveries contradicted biblical literalism were influenced by demonic deception. Feminists seeking equality were rejecting God's order through satanic pride. The pattern is consistent. Satan is invoked to delegitimize challenges to religious and social authority, while authority itself is never questioned as potentially satanic. This reveals devil mythology's social control function. If questioning authority is satanic, questioning becomes spiritually dangerous. If resisting unjust power structures is demonic, resistance gets coded as evil. If seeking autonomy from religious control is Satan's temptation, autonomy itself becomes suspect. The mythology creates framework where maintaining submission to authority seems like spiritual warfare against Satan, while actual warfare against injustice seems like serving Satan. It inverts moral reality. The oppressed seeking liberation are doing devil's work, while oppressors maintaining systems of exploitation are doing God's work, as long as they claim religious motivation. Consider how this operated during slavery. Enslaved people seeking freedom were labeled as satanically influenced, prideful, rejecting God's appointed social order, corrupted by secular ideologies. Meanwhile, slaveholders who claimed biblical justification for slavery were God's faithful servants maintaining divinely ordained hierarchy. The actual evil, enslaving humans, was framed as godly. The resistance to evil, seeking freedom, was framed as satanic. This inversion is possible because devil serves as projection screen. Slaveholders' shadow, their cruelty, exploitation, dehumanization, gets projected onto Satan, who's supposedly influencing abolitionists and rebellious enslaved people. The perpetrators remain pure in their self-concept by externalizing their evil onto their victims. The same pattern appears in how churches handle abuse. When victims come forward, they're often treated as doing Satan's work by attacking God's anointed leaders. When journalists investigate church crimes, they're framed as satanically motivated attacks on Christianity. When survivors organize for accountability, they're accused of serving demonic agenda to destroy faith. Meanwhile, the actual abusers, if they maintain proper religious performance, are treated as godly men who fell to temptation rather than as predators who used religious authority to access victims. The inversion protects perpetrators and silences victims by making exposure of evil seem more evil than the evil itself. Satan gets blamed for the exposure, not for the abuse. The mythology serves power by making challenges to power seem satanic. Nietzsche identified this as Christianity's most revealing use of devil mythology. Satan always conveniently appears wherever authority is threatened, never where authority is abusing power. This suggests the devil isn't real entity with independent existence, but theological tool deployed strategically to protect institutional interests. If Satan were real and opposed to God, he'd presumably work through corrupted religious leaders abusing their positions. But historically, Satan is invoked to condemn those challenging corrupted leaders, not the corrupted leaders themselves. The pattern indicates human construction serving human interests, not supernatural reality. The devil you're taught to fear appears exactly where institutions need you to fear: in doubt, in questioning, in resistance, in autonomy. He never appears in blind obedience. in institutional corruption, in abuse of power, in exploitation justified by religious rhetoric. What does that tell you about whether the devil is real supernatural entity or projection mechanism protecting those who benefit from you not examining their authority? The implications of devil as projection rather than entity extend into profound psychological consequences. When you externalize your shadow onto Satan, you never develop relationship with your own darkness. You never learn to recognize when your anger is justified versus when it's destructive. You never develop discernment about which desires serve your well-being versus which harm you. You never build capacity to sit with uncomfortable feelings without acting on them inappropriately. All of this requires acknowledging the darkness as yours, understanding it, integrating it. But if it's Satan's, you just fight it. You never grow psychologically, because growth requires engaging with your shadow, not projecting it outward. This creates adults with stunted emotional and psychological development. They have black and white thinking because they've never integrated gray areas. They have intense shame about natural impulses because they've learned to call those impulses demonic. They lack self-trust because they've been taught their own thoughts might be Satan's deceptions. They're vulnerable to manipulation by authorities claiming to identify satanic influences. They make poor decisions because they attribute outcomes to spiritual warfare rather than examining their own choices. The psychological cost of devil mythology is remaining permanently childish in your self-understanding, dependent on external frameworks to interpret your internal experience because you've never been allowed to engage directly with your own complexity. The social cost appears in how devil mythology prevents accountability. When you can blame Satan for your failures, you never have to examine your own responsibility. When abuse is framed as satanic attack rather than as choice made by abuser, abusers avoid consequences while victims are told to forgive and forget. When systemic injustice is attributed to demonic forces rather than to human systems humans created, those systems never get reformed. Devil serves as ultimate excuse. It wasn't really me, it was Satan's influence. This prevents the honest examination of choices and systems that actual change requires. You can't fix problems you externalize as supernatural warfare. The spiritual cost might be greatest. If you believe you're under constant demonic attack, you live in state of permanent spiritual anxiety. You're always vigilant, always suspicious of your thoughts, always performing spiritual warfare rituals, always wondering if you're doing enough to resist Satan. This isn't peace, it's psychological torment. And churches encourage it because anxious people dependent on spiritual protection are reliable congregants. They attend faithfully, donate consistently, submit to leadership readily. The devil mythology creates manufactured spiritual crisis requiring institutional solution. Without devil, you might discover you're fundamentally okay, that your struggles are normal human challenges, that you can develop your own ethical framework without mediating institutions. But with devil, you need church to survive. Your very soul is at stake in constant warfare you can't fight alone. Nietzsche recognized this as Christianity's cruelest psychological operation. It takes your own shadow, the natural human capacity for darkness that exists in everyone, externalizes it as Satan, then positions church as necessary defender against it. You end up paying institutions to fight enemy they created by teaching you to reject parts of yourself. It's genius from institutional perspective. Create the problem by fragmenting people psychologically, then sell the solution through requiring institutional mediation. But from individual perspective, it's disaster. You remain fragmented, anxious, dependent, unable to integrate your whole self, because you've been taught your whole self is dangerous. The parts of you that are natural and healthy get coded as satanic, requiring eternal vigilance against yourself. The exhaustion of fighting yourself while thinking you're fighting Satan is itself a form of hell. And unlike the hell you're taught to fear after death, this hell is real, experienced now, and entirely manufactured by devil mythology you've been taught to believe protects you from hell. The protection is the prison, the cure is the disease. Here's where Nietzsche's investigation becomes genuinely disturbing. Devil mythology wasn't organic theological development that accidentally served control functions. It was strategic construction by people who understood exactly what psychological mechanisms they were building. Medieval demonology, elaborate hierarchies of hell, specific demons with specific temptation specialties, detailed procedures for spiritual warfare, wasn't revealed knowledge. It was systematic development of mythology that creates maximum dependency on church authority for protection against manufactured threat. Church documents reveal explicit awareness of devil mythology's utility for social control. Inquisition manuals detailed how to identify satanic influence, conveniently providing frameworks that targeted anyone threatening church authority: heretics, scholars, independent women, political opponents. The witch hunts that killed hundreds of thousands across Europe used devil mythology to eliminate social deviance and consolidate religious power. Women who were too independent, too knowledgeable about healing, too resistant to patriarchal control were labeled witches in league with Satan. The mythology provided theological justification for eliminating threats, while appearing to fight spiritual warfare rather than conducting social engineering. The pattern accelerated during periods when church authority was challenged. When Protestant Reformation threatened Catholic Church, both sides intensified devil rhetoric. Catholics claimed Protestant reformers were satanically inspired. Protestants claimed Catholic Church was whore of Babylon serving Satan. Both used devil mythology to delegitimize opponents while positioning themselves as defenders against demonic influence. The devil was a theological weapon wielded in religious warfare, adapted and intensified as needed for strategic advantage. This suggests conscious deployment rather than innocent theological exploration. Modern evangelical Christianity continues this pattern with remarkable explicitness. Spiritual warfare teaching isn't just theological position, it's growth strategy. Churches offering deliverance ministry and spiritual warfare training attract members seeking protection from satanic attack. Publishing industry produces steady stream of spiritual warfare books and materials. Conference circuits feature speakers teaching demon identification and exorcism techniques. This isn't incidental ministry. It's business model that depends on maintaining belief in active demonic presence, requiring expert intervention. Financial and institutional incentives align behind promoting devil mythology, regardless of theological defensibility. The truly unsettling element is how this operates through true believers. Most pastors teaching spiritual warfare genuinely believe demons are real and active. They're not consciously manipulating congregations. They're transmitting mythology they received that serves institutional interests, that creates dependence they interpret as proper pastoral care. They see themselves as protecting people from Satan, when functionally they're installing psychological fragmentation that creates need for continued institutional intervention. The system self-perpetuates through sincere believers who can't recognize their agents of control mechanism disguised as spiritual protection. Nietzsche identified this as Christianity's most sophisticated psychological operation, creating enemy that requires institutional protection, externalizing that enemy so it can never be resolved through personal integration, adapting enemy to match whatever threatens institutional authority at any given moment. The devil is perfect control mechanism because he's invisible, he's everywhere, he's constantly attacking, and only properly trained religious authorities can fight him effectively. This creates permanent dependence that's impossible to escape without rejecting entire theological framework. And rejecting the framework itself gets coded as satanic, making exit psychologically almost impossible. The question isn't whether individual Christians are conscious conspirators. It's whether system requires conscious conspiracy when true believers naturally transmit mythology that serves institutional interests, when financial incentives reward promoting devil mythology, when social control functions emerge automatically from theology that externalizes human shadow onto supernatural enemy requiring institutional mediation. Conspiracy or not, the result is identical. Populations fragmented psychologically, dependent on religious institutions for protection from enemy. Those institutions constructed, unable to integrate their own shadow, because they've been taught their shadow is Satan. The machinery operates whether its operators understand they're operating machinery or genuinely believe they're fighting supernatural evil, and that's what makes it so effective and so difficult to escape. The question emerges, if Nietzsche exposed devil as psychological projection over a century ago, why isn't this widely understood? Why do millions still believe in literal Satan, despite psychological explanations for shadow projection? Why hasn't culture moved beyond devil mythology into mature psychology? The answer reveals how effectively the belief system protects itself from examination. The primary defense is that questioning devil's existence is itself framed as satanic. The programming includes protection against its own investigation. If you doubt Satan is real, that doubt itself is presented as Satan's most cunning deception, convincing you he doesn't exist, so you'll stop fighting him. This creates perfect closed loop. Belief in devil is protected by devil mythology itself. Any evidence against devil's existence gets reinterpreted as evidence of his cunning. Any psychological explanation gets dismissed as satanic deception. The system is self-sealing through making its examination seem like confirming its truth. The second defense is that devil belief provides psychological comfort despite being psychologically damaging. Externalizing your shadow onto Satan is easier than integrating it. Blaming failures on demonic attack is easier than examining your choices. Living in black and white world with clear external enemy is simpler than navigating psychological complexity where you contain both light and darkness. Most people prefer comforting mythology to uncomfortable truth. Facing that your darkness is yours, that your struggles are your responsibility, that evil capacity exists within you, not just an external demon. This is psychologically demanding work. Devil mythology offers escape from that work through externalization. So people maintain belief, not because evidence supports it, but because alternative requires psychological maturity they're not prepared to develop. The third defense is social consequences for rejecting devil belief in religious communities. Expressing doubt about Satan's existence in evangelical church marks you as spiritually compromised, possibly satanically deceived yourself, dangerous to others' faith. You face social isolation, loss of community standing, severed relationships. For people whose entire social structure is church-based, the cost of honest doubt is complete social upheaval. So most suppress their questions, maintain surface belief, never voice the obvious psychological explanations for experiences attributed to Satan. This prevents collective examination that might destabilize the belief system. Each doubter thinks they're alone and keeps quiet to maintain belonging. Modern resistance follows these patterns precisely. When you present psychological evidence that devil is projection, believers respond that psychology itself is satanic deception, that secular explanations are demonic tools to destroy faith, that you're doing Satan's work by undermining belief in his existence. The emotional intensity reveals what's being defended. It's not just doctrine, it's entire psychological framework for managing internal complexity through externalization. Acknowledging devil is projection means acknowledging need to integrate shadow, to develop psychological maturity, to take responsibility for own darkness. That's threatening to people whose entire identity is built on being good Christians fighting external evil. They need devil to be real so they can continue externalizing rather than integrating. The most effective suppression is that devil belief gets continuously reinforced through attribution bias. Any negative experience gets attributed to Satan. Intrusive thoughts, relationship conflicts, unexpected setbacks, psychological struggles. This constant attribution maintains belief without requiring evidence. The experiences are real, the interpretation is arbitrary. But when everything bad gets coded as satanic attack, the accumulation of negative experiences seems like accumulation of evidence for Satan's existence. The person never examines whether natural, psychological and social processes explain these experiences better than supernatural warfare explanation. Churches encourage this attribution pattern through teaching that sees Satan everywhere, ensuring members never develop alternative explanatory frameworks. The system persists because it exploits psychological vulnerabilities, because it protects itself through framing examination as threat, because it provides simple explanations for complex psychological phenomena, because communities reinforce it through social pressure, because leaving means confronting your shadow without mythology to externalize it onto. Devil belief survives not because it's true, but because it serves psychological and social functions that people are unwilling to surrender. The question isn't whether conscious suppression exists. It's whether such suppression is necessary when the belief system is engineered to resist examination and when believers benefit psychologically from maintaining it despite the damage it causes. The final question isn't whether the devil exists metaphysically. The final question is whether devil mythology serves you or imprisons you. And the evidence is overwhelming. Externalizing your shadow onto Satan prevents psychological